How do you do, and welcome to the first in our series of discussions with various pioneers, really, in the establishment and development of the University of Texas MD Anderson Hospital and Tumor Institute in Houston. It began a long time ago, and a man who came with this institution in its very beginning and probably was here for all the labor pains, certainly the birth of the institution, Mr. John H. Musgrove, known by many, many people who've worked here over the years and many people around Houston and all over Texas. Mr. Musgrove, the legislation, as I recall, was passed in 1941 establishing a cancer research hospital for Texas, and you were one of the first ones on the scene when it was finally decided that it would be put in temporary headquarters down at the old Baker estate.
I believe that is correct, sir. In 1941 legislation,
Yes.
if that is an answer to your question.
Now, when did you come to Houston?
in December of 1942.
And as I recall, there was a World War going on, World War II at the time. Here you were to sort of get an old palatial estate, really, converted to what would be a cancer research institute. Can you tell me what it looked like the first time you saw it?
It was a temporary location, to be a temporary location for the beginning of the University of Texas MD Anderson Hospital for Cancer Research. It was 6 acres, right down near the heart of town now, on Baldwin Street, known at that time as the Oaks. It had been the home of Captain James A. Baker, an attorney here, and a philanthropist, as I understand. I never knew him. Just the name is familiar to me. And the place had been vacated something like a year before by a member of the family, and had been taken over by the MD Anderson Foundation for use by the University of Texas for this pilot project, or the beginning of the cancer research program.
Ultimately, of course, the new and larger institution was built in the Texas Medical Center, but that was the home of the MD Anderson Hospital as we knew it from about 1943, I believe, until 1954. Is that right?
That is true, yes, sir.
Some 11 years. Mr. Musgrove, you have served in many capacities over the years, but now let's go back way before 1941, way up to East Texas, around Commerce up there someplace. I think that's where you first saw the light of day.
That was my birthplace, yes.
What did you do in your early years? Were you a farm boy?
We did farm, yes, and it didn't turn out so well, and later, just on various jobs. I had an early job working night in a bakery, you know.
At Commerce?
No, in Mount Pleasant. I moved to Mount Pleasant years, I was quite a young fellow, 12 years old, something like that.
Is that so?
And just knocked about, just whatever might be available for a young fellow. And then eventually went to work for Burris Mill, an elevator company at Fort Worth, in sales. I was never as good in sales as I thought I was, or they thought I was, but during a depressed time.
Well, Burris was a large establishment, as I recall.
Very large, very large.
Flour, feeds, and so on. What territory did you cover?
Well, I worked a small territory in northeast Texas. Titus, Wood County, Camp County, Morris County, and just I was not limited to any particular area. If there was a place back in the woods somewhere in a very remote area and I thought I could sell a little flour feed, I went back in there. And
you sold to what? Local grocery stores and feed stores?
And I had a bakery account too, which was kind of a meal ticket for me, because I would make about $40 on a carload of flour.
I see. Now, did you work on a salary And commission
Well,
or
on
straight
the on
commission?
the I worked on a salary on everything but the bakery sales, car lot stuff, and I would get a commission on that. It was pretty good in those days. You know, if you made $150 a month
Oh.
and furnished your transportation and whatnot, you were
Now,
making
you're talking
big
about
money.
the Depression, the 30s.
Well, and then before that
yeah.
too. Yes, in the 30s.
But $150 a month was very good.
Yeah, you didn't
To,
make that every month.
Now, what led you from that sort of a, to me, promising career into something that eventually led to your association with the M.D. Anderson
Well,
Hospital?
I had a little problem with my physical build-up, and I had to have it corrected. And Burris, at that time, had plenty of good men to choose from, not somebody with a problem, you know. So I was not insurable, so they said. That was what they told me. And after I was released by my physician, Burris had filled the place, and I was out of a job. So I began looking around, and I found a place in Austin with a park system as an accountant. As I didn't know much about it, but it didn't seem to make much difference, you know.
So this is when you first entered into the employ of the state of Texas.
Yes. And I had a friend that I had met and socialized with a lot up there with the state auditor's office. He audited my work and was kind enough to overlook a lot of my shortcomings in accounting. I was an auditor for the park system, and he left the auditor's office and went to Galveston with a medical school, and having known of me and my capacities and incapacities, he offered me a place with a medical school, which I was very happy to get.
Now, about what time was this? What date?
40, I guess it was 42.
Early.
Yes.
Early in 40.
No, late in 42.
Just before you came.
Yes, sir.
You hadn't been there very long
No,
then when
no,
you
no.
came to Houston. Who was head of the school then when you went there?
Chauncey Leake, Dr. Chauncey Leake.
Yes. Dr. Chauncey Leake being a Ph.D., I think you told me one time, not an M.D.
Well, I would like to correct that statement. It was my understanding he was not an M.D. I did know he was a Ph.D. Now, I never did confirm that statement that he was not. He may
We
not.
both know he's a tremendous poet and writer.
Tremendous
and
man,
fine
too.
gentleman.
We bet he was.
Now, he had succeeded, I believe, Dr. John Speed.
That's right.
Who actually was in on a lot of the planning and the establishing of the M.D. Anderson Hospital.
I understand that he was.
Had left the institution by that time and had been replaced by Dr. Leake. Now, when you went there, Dr. Leake was your
Yes,
boss.
sir. That's right.
How
Well,
did
he was
you...
not my immediate supervisor. He was the
boss.
head of the institution, the whole institution. I was interviewed by Dr. Leake and served the customary orange juice drink that he served all of his guests, and had a nice visit with him. I had great regard for Dr. Leake. I don't know that he's still living.
Yes,
but,
he is.
everyone that knew him
with us.
thought well of him.
Yes.
And
Now,
he did a marvelous job.
What did you do there at the Galveston
Well,
Medical School?
I went there to work as an assistant to the plant supervisor, but they were having an audit of the whole institution. It seemed like things were not just like Dr. Leake wanted them, and he had, I believe, asked for an audit of the whole institution, financial and otherwise, physical. And since I had had some experience in that field, I was asked to work with the auditors and trying to get the paperwork together and whatnot. That is what I was doing all the time that I was in Galveston, working with the staff of state auditors. And, well, it had not been completed when I left there. I don't know when the audit was completed, but it evidently was satisfactory to all those.
What led you to become interested in this new institution that they were trying to create in Houston?
They were going to operate this.
The medical school at Galveston.
Yes,
this
had planned to, Dr. Lee, yes. As a part of the medical school. And it was, they had been asked to staff it with just a small group to get the thing underway.
Yes.
We had to have a starting date. So actually the starting date was the 12th of December, 1942. And the men they had down there were needed on their particular job. The job up here was not so demanding at that time because we had nothing but a house, some outhouses, and a lawn, some shrubbery.
Stables.
Stables, right. And so they selected me to come up and work under their direction, which I did do. I worked with the architect. I worked with everyone that would listen to me to try to get the thing going.
Well, now, for people a little younger than you and I that may not be familiar with the status of things in 1942, I think we should point out that there was one University of Texas medical school at the time. The University of Texas dental branch, as we know it today, had not come into the system. It was in the Houston Dental College. So it was the health care teaching system in this state consisted pretty much of that medical school and some nursing teaching, so that it was natural then that the Cancer Research Hospital would fall under the jurisdiction of that medical school.
That's right.
And Dr. E.W. Bertner, a practicing Houston physician, prominent physician in this town, had been appointed by the Board of Regents as the acting director of the Cancer Hospital. And I believe you had a little discussion with him before preliminary to taking this job.
Yes, I did. I would have to have his blessing. He was the boss. I had gone to, well, I had been employed by the university at Austin and then was sent to Galveston. I met Dr. Rainey, talked with him. Mr. Simmons actually was my immediate supervisor, who has since retired.
Yes.
And
we have visited with Mr. Simmons in our series
Yes.
of historical
well,
interviews.
you know his story.
Yes.
It's a great one. I see him occasionally here at the hospital with his wife.
Well, we might point out, too, for those not familiar with this particular detail, that Mr. Simmons acted in the capacity of business manager. He had several titles over the years, but he was more or less the business manager for the University of Texas system at that time.
That would be a good title. However, it was not his title,
No.
but that would be,
That's
that
his
would
function,
describe
though.
his function, yes.
Right, he had various titles.
Yes, he did. He was actually the comptroller. I believe know
Right.
what he was.
Yes, well, he had 2 or 3, and he also was a professor. He was on the faculty at one time.
He referred to that as his parachute always. In case he got kicked out, he could go back to teaching.
Right. But you had to have his approval before
Right.
you made this
Yes.
change. You had to have Dr. Bertner's approval
Right, that's
before you
right.
could make the change. And, of course, you had to have Dr. Leake's approval. After you talked to Dr. Bertner, could you tell pretty much how he felt about the thing?
Yes, I thought I could. I had a visit with him about an hour in his office downtown, which was in, at that time, the Second National Bank building. And after the interview, I went on back to Galveston and talked with Dr. Leake, I believe it was, and maybe others, and he asked me how says, you did all right in Austin. How do you think you did in Houston? And I said, well, I don't think I did too good. So it didn't look favorable. So I remember Dr. Leach said, well, we'll see. I think maybe you did all right. So in a few days, he told me to pack up, come on over here, do the best I could, and he would direct me from time to time. He and one of his associates, Mr. Kappelman. But
now, how did you explain all of this moving around to Mrs. Musgrove?
Well, she, you know, we've always worked as a team, you know,
right.
and I would generally try to sell her on the project, on the idea before I went into it too deeply. And she is a very understanding person, and really, she's a queen. But she, if I tried hard enough, I could convince her, and it was an increase in salary, you know, and a little better situation.
The little facet of this story that I'm probing for here is that the university used to train many of its people, you know, by putting them out on the job there for a short while.
Yes. I was expecting that, so go ahead.
And I think maybe you had that in mind as a parachute, too, that might rescue you in case you needed to go back to Galveston.
Yes, sir. That's right. And that had not been discussed prior to my coming over here, but I felt like Dr. Leak would not send me out just to get rid of me, you know.
Yeah.
That he'd keep his arm around me, and Mr. Kappelman could, well, any kind of help was pretty hard to get in those days, and they could find a place for me somewhere if I failed on this thing. But I felt like with the help I had with Mr. Simmons and his staff and the Galveston group that I couldn't get too far off, that they were swell people.
Well, I know you mentioned that Mrs. Musgrove again asked you the other day, some 30 years later, you know, if this temporary thing had finally...
Here we come back. Yes, I want to record that too, if I may. But it seemed to be a policy in the early days of the university. I don't, those 35 years don't seem to be early to anybody but me. But they would send out their young executives, trainees, out into the field to get some field experience, you know, and, if they had any promise at all, and then they'd call them back, you know, later after they got the rough ends off and so forth. But she reminded me some years later that I had never been called back, you know.
You're still in training, I guess.
Yes, it seemed like 35 years was a long time, you know. But that was great.
Well, now here you are. There were some other men came along here, some scientists that were doing some research down there. And that's going to be another story. Right now, it was your responsibility on the scene, working with Mr. Simmons and others, to begin to get a mansion and a group of outbuildings, stables and otherwise, converted to research laboratories, ultimately a clinic, and so on. This is at the height of World War II. Building materials aren't available. You can hardly get people to work, you know. They're just not available. They're tied up. This is the problem that confronted John Musgrove when he hit here. It got solved some way or another. How did you go about that, Mr. Musgrove?
Well,
Had there been plans drawn up? Were there architects?
well, they were underway. We thought they were further along than they were when we came to Houston to start the project. The firm had been pretty busy with some defense projects and hadn't got off the drawing board too well, but we did get it off. The plans were finally finalized and submitted to Washington for their approval and for priorities. And Then a contract was made with a local firm, Norman Benz and Jack Lender, I believe. The names might be familiar to some of the great fellows.
Right.
Well, they started the job of rehabilitating the place, putting it into working order. It was a marvelous piece of work and a very functional thing. There was a lot to be done when they finished. That was not in the original planning. And from that beginning, where we was able to get some projects underway, research projects, we went from there on into what would just a gradual step up until the end of the war, until Dr. Clark came. And he had a great push about him, Dr. Clark. Dr.
You
Bertner
just
did too.
introduced a name there that's familiar to all of us, but in 1943, Dr. Clark wasn't known in these parts. As a matter of fact, he was busy elsewhere in military activity and so on. Dr. Bertner was the active director through those war years.
Yes.
Was he able to get much of a physician staff
Yes.
at the time?
He selected his staff from the local group of private practicing physicians. They were very anxious to help Dr. Bertner get this thing moving to where it would have some status, you know, and might invite others in the years to come. But it had to have a starting place. It had to have somebody to start it. It had to have a staff, and they were anxious to, he was able to get those he selected.
Now, they, I'm sure, weren't paid some tremendous salary.
They weren't paid anything.
They worked voluntarily.
Yes, sir. And
Was
they had
Dr.
assignments.
In other words, they had commitments.
Yes, sir.
Was Dr. Bertner able to exercise to get from them what he expected from them on that basis?
I thought he was, sir. And I believe he was. I have seen him work. I have seen him work with the groups. I have seen him take his turn, you know. And I've seen him in committee meetings and staff meetings and whatnot. And they were all anxious to contribute all they could to this project.
Now comes on the scene after the war, 1946, I believe, Dr. R. Lee Clark, who was the result, really, of a fairly wide search conducted by the University of Texas. Dr. Bertner was in on this and many others, but he was appointed, as I recall, in August of 46 to be the permanent director of the institution, surgeon-in-chief, and so on. And that's when things began to really move forward.
That is true.
Dr. Bertner, in the meantime, left the acting directorship and became the first president of the Texas Medical Center Incorporated. By now, the present location of the Texas Medical Center had been acquired by the M.D. Anderson Foundation, and plots of property, locations, had been given to the various institutions, and things were beginning to move forward and needed a lot of coordinating. Dr. Bertner took over that responsibility. Dr. Clark then proceeded with this institution. Do you recall how he first began to envision what we now know today as the M.D. Anderson Hospital? It's a long distance, you know, from the Baker estate down on Baldwin.
I'm not sure how much orientation Dr. Clark had with respect to the Anderson Hospital before he came onto the scene, before he accepted this thing. It had to offer him something, or he wouldn't have come.
Sure.
But I imagine, I presume, he had many conferences with Dr. Painter, who was president of the university, and with Dr. Bertner. And he apparently was well pleased with the possible future.
He set a course, and that course has been followed closely and successfully over the years. And we have just a few minutes, Mr. Musgrove, and I'd like to kind of point up one fact. I know that John Musgrove has served this institution in many, many capacities over the years. It must have been fascinating and interesting for you. You came up here to try to get the Baker Estate rebuilt, you might say, or converted to an institution. From there, can you kind of proceed down through the various things you've done in this institution over the years?
I came as an employee of the medical school as an assistant to the business manager there. I occupied that capacity, or had that title for, I think, through that fiscal year. And it was a temporary assignment, and the title carried the word temporary by it. And then at the end of that fiscal year, I became a business manager with an increase in salary. I came over at $250 a month, which was big money for people my capacity, and I went to $300 a month. But in those days, the legislature, in preparing a budget or finalizing of the budget, I would say, they would line item, if you know what I mean, sir. They would say, Dr. Leak, you are this, that, and so forth, and that position pays, what, $15,000 or $10,000 or whatever it may. Well, in this position that I was to occupy as business manager, it didn't show an increase, but they had a position on there for superintendent. So I was handling the budget here, of course with Dr. Burton's approval, but he had many other things to do to get things rolling without having to lose a lot of time with the minor salaries and so forth, the yard men and the people. So I said, well, if I can't occupy the business manager's job at $300 a month, then I'll be superintendent, you know. So he said, okay, so I became superintendent. And then sometime in the past, the salaries got more in line with the cost of living, and I did become business manager. And about 1954, shortly before we came out here, Mr. Joe Boyd, whom you may have met, he was with the auditing staff of the university, internal auditor, and he came onto the scene, a very capable man, was then and is today, as a finance officer. And I forget exactly what his title was, might have been finance officer, which took over most of the administrative duties that I had had in the past. And maybe a year, maybe two, I don't recall, in a revamping of the administrative department, Mr. Boyd became what? Let's say business manager, I'm not sure. And he had selected one of the men in the business office, an accountant. We were just going into data processing to be his first assistant. And I became, at that time, I believe the title was Procurement and Supply Officer, which I liked very much. I regretted having to get that up. And it included a lot of things maybe that someone else could have done better. But
well, now this is October 1974, Mr. Musgrove. What's the status of John Musgrove today?
John Musgrove has retired, and I'm not pleased at all with having retired. I have idle time on my hands I feel younger than I am. I probably am not.
That's a pretty healthy situation.
But I miss my work. I miss the association. I find that coming here each day, which I try to do, is a part of my life. It makes retirement more bearable. I could not be idle. The people that I've known, we grew up together in the institution as a family, is getting smaller. Some of them are retiring, some other things have happened too, but I still feel a part of the family. I think I will make new
Mr.
friends.
Musgrove, I know that I speak for a lot of people in this institution when I say you're a permanent part of this family, and you always
I want to
will
be.
We appreciate you coming to visit with us this morning. Our time and our tape have run out, and we appreciate it very much. We're going to talk to you again some of these days because I think we just got in about one chapter of this.
Okay. May I say this, sir? And I enjoyed my work very much. I've said that before. Another thing I want to say is that in my capacities, I was always well paid for what I'd done. I was well received anywhere I went within the institution. Well, it's just a part of my life.
I think that idea is sort of a reciprocal kind of thing, mutual, I believe is the word for that feeling, because I know that this institution, and as I say, the people who have headed it, managed it, and so on, and the people who have worked here at all levels are very happy that John Musgrove was around and still is.
I'm very happy that I was around. I hope I contributed something.
Thank you, Mr. Musgrove.